Hi, this is Dr. Sezin Zengin. Today we are together with Professor Polański from Poland. He is the professor at Warsaw School of Economics. And we will be talking about the Poland's transition in last 30 years. Very welcome, Professor Polański.
Thank you very much and welcome.
And my first question, since the Poland had major economic transition 30 years ago, and this is the 30th anniversary, could you give us brief information regarding to the historical events during that period?
30 years ago, I mean exactly in 1989 and 1990, because the top period of our transition were these 2 years. It was a process, a political process, which led to very deep changes in the economic system and consequently in economic policy in Poland. As probably most of you know, Poland until the end of the 1980s was so-called socialist country, meaning that a communist party was ruling. We had an economy based on state ownership. And this economy did not work very well. There were serious problems. Finally, in the 80s, we had strong inflation, recession as well, plus so-called economics of shortage. So in short, it means that people had money but couldn't buy things. So many things were simply not available. And in Poland, people were unhappy with this economic system for many years. But when the problems came at the late 1970s, in the second half of the 1970s, then opposition began to gather. And there was a social political movement called Solidarność in Poland, which was very important, very vocal in 1980, 1981. Then after that, the Communist Party imposed so-called martial law. So in other words, this Solidarity trade union was banned, and basically there was no political activity. Communists tried to reform the economic system. However, this resulted in a total collapse of the economy. So this economics of shortage, strong inflation continued to develop. At the end of the 80s, a recession appeared. Consequently, this led the communists to think about cooperating to transfer peacefully the power from the communist part to the opposition leaders, to the opposition movement, which resulted from the Solidarity trade union. And in 1989, we have so-called round-table talks between the two sides. They agreed on elections, partially free elections, partially democratic elections. These elections was entirely won by the opposition party, but as I said, it was partially free elections, therefore not everything went to the opposition. However, a new parliament emerged, which decided to form a new government, the first, as we call it now, the first non-communist government, and this was formed in September 1989. And the new government introduced economic policies starting from the beginning of the 1990s, which entirely changed Polish economic system and Polish society as well.
And you had all these historic events in the last 30 years becoming part of European Union and the recent change in European Union. What about that process? What about that part of the history?
That came later, although from the beginning it was even suggested by the late communists that we should join the European Union. So I think from the beginning, from 1989, the path towards European Union was set. But it took almost 15 years because we joined European Union in 2014 as of 1st of May 2004, not 14, 2004. And therefore now it is 15 years, the 15th anniversary of being in the European Union this year. And the process was complicated because Poland became part of the Western world, and we entered rapidly into the globalization process. On one hand, we were a very more kind of backward society coming from the communist times. Then we entered the new world, which was quickly progressing. Globalization developed, but also the digital communication and so on. Therefore, our economic reforms had to accelerate because on the one hand we wanted to join the European Union, while on the other hand we had to cope with the reality.
And what about, so out of these 30 years, 15 years were right after the communist regime. You were not part of the European Union, but the next 15 years you were part of the European Union. So about the point of economic developments, can you compare those two terms?
Well, some people say, and I think this is a correct approach, that in 1990, when we changed economic policy, we received a very important push for the development because we introduced a market economy with stabilized inflation. It was so-called shock therapy, and the economy was privatized and so on. But after 15 years, the impact of these great reforms vanished a little bit or slowed down the impact. And you know, joining the European Union was like a second push to develop, or the development. So new regulations appeared, were put in place, plus many funds, financial resources from the European arrived to Poland, and they helped a lot. Plus, of course, we became part of the common European Union market, and that's very important. But in the first 15 years before joining the European Union, we prepared ourselves for this challenge, being a member of the European Union, which means also to expose more your enterprises to international competition, European Union competition. And I think we prepared ourselves quite well during this first 15 years before joining the European Union. That's why I think we are very successful during the European Union period. And let me only say that, for instance, the crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009 basically did not touch us profoundly. So we haven't had recession, for instance. We continue developing. This was, among other things, because we have a floating exchange rate regime. We didn't join the euro area, for instance. Therefore, our currency, because of this great shock after the Lehman Brothers collapse, produced a depreciation of the zloty, and therefore, you know, our competitiveness was maintained in the European Union and in the international market in general.
Okay, and let me ask you, what was the broader international context of Polish events in 1989?
Well, let me say first that Polish developments are remarkable. That's why I'm speaking to you about this. But that was not only because we were so intelligent or that we prepared the things so well. It's true, we did certain things very well, but the international context before starting the transition is very important. Probably without the Russian perestroika, things which happened in Poland would not be possible. So also the Soviet Union tried to reform itself, and they suggested, in other words, to the members of the Soviet bloc that we should reform ourselves as well. So that's probably that's why probably after the imposition of martial law in Poland in December 1981, in the second half of the 1980s, communist leaders decided to reform the system. Okay, so I think this international context, what happened inside the Soviet bloc, is very important. Now, after 1989, 1990, I think the impact of Polish developments was strongly visible almost in the entire world, let me put this, at least in Europe and in Asia. So in Europe, for instance, the fall of the Berlin Wall, that happened in the fall of 1989. So after the new government, the first non-communist government was formed in Poland. So we obviously influenced developments in other post-socialist countries, European post-socialist countries. But pay attention that also events of this type, the transition to a market economy, followed in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed, some countries separated, which introduced their own reforms. Russia became the successor of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, and they also tried to reform their economic system. Therefore, I think the impact was profound on both, at least on both Europe and at least part of Asia.
Okay, and what were the results of these new economic policies?
Well, in Poland they were very, very good. I think we can talk about a miracle. As I mentioned before, we even felt very deeply the crisis which followed in the entire world after the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in September 2008. Now, it's good to give some figures, maybe, in general. So let me say that in terms of economic growth, we more than doubled our GDP. So the average for the 30 years of growth, and let me say that the first 2 years, 1990, 1991, when the reforms were introduced, were quite bad in terms of economic growth. We had a so-called transitional recession. Also, you should remember that the COMECON economic area, the economic area of the Soviet countries, also disappeared. So all the trade links were broken. This contributed to this early transition recession. However, if you take 30 years in total, then our GDP grew by 3.5% on average. So it's a lot for 30 years. So as I said, our GDP more than doubled. As concerns inflation, the big problem of the socialist economy, we stabilized inflation. It was a long process, basically more than 10 years. But at the time when we were joining the European Union, we stabilized the prices completely. And we introduced the so-called direct inflation targeting strategy, and this was very successful. In a market economy, there is a problem always with unemployment, and this was also a problem for Poland. But nowadays, our unemployment rate is very low, it's below 5%. Once again, depending on the measure, according to the European Union, the Eurostat, it is 3-point-something%, so it's really low. So I think on balance, the period of these last 30 years was very, very successful.
Okay, what about the other countries? What lessons can be learned from Polish experience?
I think it's a very difficult question. In general, I can say that Polish example proved that certain things are possible. So we can conduct a very deep political, economic, social change without war, without revolution, without killing people, and so on. So I think it shows that this is possible. Of course, all the countries are different, all societies are different, all the nations are different, the history of each country is different, therefore it's not easy to give concrete lessons. But I think concrete lessons could be that deep changes have to be made in an evolutionary way. However, at a certain point of time, you need what is being called in the case of Poland a big bang, an abrupt change. And in Poland, this abrupt change took place at the beginning of 1990 when the economic reforms were implemented. So, opening of the economy, liberalization of foreign trade, liberalization of prices, which increased inflation for a while, change in monetary policy, change in fiscal policy, new type of taxes. All this was basically done in Poland in the span of 2 years. So it was the so-called shock therapy. But afterwards, you need gradual evolutionary development to really implement all these changes in the mind of people, and only then the new system starts to work properly.
Okay. And let me ask you one last question. How do you see the near future of Polish economy?
Quite well, because I think, we have a very tough legacy. You should remember that Poland was partitioned. It did not exist in the 19th century as a country. So as a country, as a state, we did not exist for 123 years. And some people say, and I think that's a correct approach, although it is very vague at the same time, that basically we are recovering after 3 centuries. Okay, so if we are recovering after these centuries, and during these 3 centuries, many things happened internally in Poland and externally because the Western world developed very quickly. I think our main target is to join the living standards of the Western world. And I think sooner or later we will make it, although, nowadays the situation is quite shaky around the world. There are trade wars, there is a lot of uncertainty, but I think the general conviction is that we will continue progressing.
Okay, that was great. It was a pleasure to interview you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.